Hello, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute's 2021 Capitol Hill Briefing Series. I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of CHCI. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month graduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional Latinos unparalleled exposure to hands-on experience in public policy. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, specifically in the areas of health, technology, housing, child welfare, and education. CHCI is thrilled to be able to offer our graduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues they're passionate about and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. We would like to thank our Graduate Fellowship Program sponsors for supporting the program, including Facebook, the PepsiCo Foundation, Casey Family Programs, the Walton Family Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, DaVita, Wells Fargo, CVS Health, Fresenius Medical Care, and Bank of America. You can keep today's conversation going by using the hashtag CHCI Fellows on social media. Please visit chci.org to learn more about our Graduate Fellowship Program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows via LinkedIn to find out more about their policy topic and help them connect with job opportunities for when their program concludes in May. Enjoy the discussion.
Please help me in welcoming the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, representing the state of Oregon, Senator Rob Wyden.
Ron Wyden here. I'd like to give a warm welcome to all of you for today's very important panel discussion. 15 million children across the United States live in a home with domestic violence. This is a staggering and heartbreaking statistic. Millions of kids are suffering both short and long-term damage to their psychological, emotional, behavioral, and physical health. Domestic violence must be treated like the public health crisis it is. What's too often left out of this conversation is how the impact of domestic violence on children of color is worsened by the racial disparities that exist within the very systems designed to protect them. In order to best protect and serve all children, I want to address those disparities head on and to ensure that violence prevention efforts are inclusive and comprehensive. Nobody believes this more than the esteemed Marina Lugo, who will be moderating today's panel on this important topic. She is the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Child Welfare Graduate Fellow, working with my staff on the Senate Finance Committee. As a survivor of domestic violence, her personal and professional experience make her an invaluable member of our team as we advocate for children and families hurt by domestic violence. Everybody, please join me in welcoming Marina Lugo and all my best for a terrific discussion today.
Thank you, Senator Wyden, for the kind and thoughtful introduction. I am continually inspired by the work you and your incredible team do on behalf of children and families across the United States. Before we begin, I want to remind you that the topics we discuss today may be triggering. Even within this virtual space, I encourage you all to take a step away from your screens if you need to, make space for yourself, and if you'd like additional resources, I empower you to visit the links below. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this vital discussion today. My name is Marina Lugo, and I'm the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Child Welfare Graduate Fellow, and I am part of the statistic and part of the change. Children exposed to domestic violence are much more likely to enter a violent relationship as adolescents or as adults, and I was no different. I entered my abusive relationship at 17, and over the course of 4 years, my abuser loved me so much, he showed me every shade of violence. From isolating me from my friends and family to threatening to harm himself if I didn't do as he said, I unraveled. I became someone I no longer recognized. I never smiled, and I became irrationally afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing, as if I was flinching through life. My saving grace was an extra credit workshop in college. Some might call it fate, others chance, and others still a miracle, because the workshop I had chosen blindly, the workshop I had chosen out of a scheduling convenience, happened to be a workshop on unhealthy relationships. And as I sat there, I was engrossed by what was being discussed and found I had a lot to contribute to the conversation. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard the phrase domestic violence. It was also the first time I felt like I wasn't suffocating under the weight of not having the language to name my experience. And before my head could catch up with my body, I was walking to the student facilitators asking how I could get involved. Soon after, I became an active volunteer for the Women's Resource Center, assisting in putting together Take Back the Night and the Clothesline Project, 2 events that honor survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I also became a peer educator for our campus sexual assault and violence prevention education group. I spent most of my time working tirelessly to help establish our campus care office, a department that provides resources for survivors, and help create its prevention and education programs, including the Be Healthy with Your Honey campaign, which exists to this day. So this random workshop became what would eventually restore and save my life. It would give me the courage to leave my abuser and the resources and tools to push for change for other survivors. I learned 2 things through my experiences doing prevention work. First, when I started to research domestic violence, I realized that the information was really difficult to find, even as a college student. And when I did find relevant information, it didn't fully capture my experience. And second, of the survivors I did meet, almost all of them said they'd been exposed to domestic violence at a young age, or grew up in households that normalized unhealthy or abusive behaviors. I've read hundreds, maybe thousands of pages now, looking for answers only to come up with more questions. But in asking those questions, I've identified that the most critical gaps in the discussion about domestic violence and prevention are how culture affects the way children navigate exposure to domestic violence, and how children of color are uniquely impacted. As a Mexican and South Asian woman, my cultural upbringing played an enormous role in how I dealt with my violent relationship. This experience isn't unique. In fact, culture often rules over many of the experiences of youth of color, especially as it relates to violence and trauma. Despite this, children of color are rarely at the center of domestic violence discussions, and Latino children are all but erased. Despite representing over 4 million Californians and 48% of the total child population, Latino children in California are not centered in domestic violence prevention policies. For Latino youth, the impact of exposure to domestic violence are worsened by disparities in health, poverty, structural racism, and familism, the cultural value that prioritizes family over the individual. Without addressing the disparities that exist within the systems meant to protect children from domestic violence, we cannot make true progress. That is why I am deeply honored to amplify the expertise and passion of my panelists today. Their work has helped fill in the gaps in conversations, programs, research, and direct services being provided to racial and ethnic minorities. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists. As we begin our discussion, I'm honored to introduce our first panelist for today, Lashonda Coleman. Award-winning international speaker and educator, Lashonda embodies the values of compassion, service, justice, and empowerment. As a leading administrator within higher education, she has developed programs to combat interpersonal violence and inspire wellness and resilience. She is also a senior trainer for MVP strategies. Lashonda earned her Master of Social Work degree at the University of Southern California and anticipates completing her doctorate in the philosophy of clinical social work in 2021. Please welcome Lashonda Coleman.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you to the CHCI graduate, the fellowship program. It is such an honor to be here today. As you shared, Marina, this issue of domestic violence is something that impacts our children disproportionately, particularly our children of color. While I recognize that anyone who's experienced domestic violence, dating violence, that their experience matters, it is incredibly important to recognize the gaps in how we address these issues. As a licensed clinical social worker, I've had the opportunity to walk alongside survivors of such abuse, both adults, children, adolescents, and I found that there is an opportunity to go upstream, so to speak, and to prevent these matters from occurring through education. Marina, you also spoke earlier about systems and how the disparities across systems, whether it's education, health, contributes to the violence that occurs. And so I hope today that we can talk about how we can address the inequities across these systems to benefit our children, to keep them safe. I also bring to this space my understanding of trauma and how it impacts the body. I recognize that when we talk about interpersonal violence, and that violence can be physical violence, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and this is not an exhaustive list. But anytime there's an imbalance of power and control, and that power and control is used to oppress, to harm, to discriminate against another being, then we're looking at, within the context of relationship, we're looking at potential dating domestic violence. And so it's important to understand how this trauma impacts the body, and that there is an opportunity in addressing the trauma for us to break the cycle of abuse. And it's not only working with the survivor who's traumatized, but again, also addressing systems of oppression that create spaces and conditions in which this type of abuse can occur. And so I want to have an opportunity today, as we talk through this issue, to just talk about how we can help to shift the trajectory by working with children who have been traumatized, to leverage some of their protective factors, their resilience, to help them understand that they are worthy of safe spaces, of healing, that there is a way forward to healing, and that we can break the cycle of abuse. I also look forward to an opportunity to be in discussion about just intervention and prevention, and how programs are funded within communities of color, looking at programs that are proactive instead of in addition to, rather, responsive. And so whether there are parenting courses that do value the difference culturally, what are the cultural values, and really using partnering with the community to help educate the community on healthy ways to parent, healthy and safe ways to engage within relationship, but not coming in with an agenda, but really understanding the community. Again, understanding the strengths of that community, not looking at the community in a deficit perspective, but saying this community has amazing resilience factors, protective factors, and how can we leverage that? How can we leverage this tight connection as a family and the safety within a family, how can we leverage that to educate the community about dating domestic violence and what to watch out for and where to intervene? In the work that I do with mentors and violence prevention, we really look at leadership as key in changing the course and shifting the paradigm. We recognize that in these situations, oftentimes there are other people who notice that there's abuse that's happening, and maybe they don't name it abuse, but we know that as leaders, as bystanders, there's an opportunity to really empower them as leaders to interrupt the cycle of abuse, to interrupt situations where there's abusive language being spoken, or one is isolating the children or their partner, their spouse, that they have an opportunity, if given skills, if given information and opportunity to lead, that we really want those people who do life with the family to intervene as bystanders, as leaders, to be courageous, to speak out and to speak up, to help shift the trajectory. And so again, I look forward today to hear from the panel, who I'm so just honored to serve alongside this morning. I look forward to furthering the conversation. Thank you so much.
Lashonda, thank you for opening our panel with your passion and invaluable insight. I'd really like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Gabriela Liva Stein. Dr. Liva Stein is a licensed psychologist and associate professor of clinical psychology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her program of research identifies individual risk and protective processes for Latinx and other minoritized youth when facing cultural stressors. She has published more than 50 peer-reviewed papers on these issues, and clinically, she specializes in the provision of therapeutic services to Latinx families and provides training to providers working with Latinx communities. Please welcome Dr. Liva Stein.
Thank you so much, Marina. And I also thank you to the fellowship for sponsoring this important talk today in this panel discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about familism values. So Marina mentioned these earlier as she was starting in terms of what are these values. That's the research I've spent a lot of time doing, is understanding the unique cultural processes in Latinx families. And familism values, as Marina mentioned, is when you subjugate yourself as an individual to the good of the family. These values include sort of family honor, family obligations to support and get along with the family, to respect people in positions of authority in the family, adults and parents, or a very hierarchical organization of how the family works, as well as sort of expectations of social support, monetary support that you have with each other. Ultimately, what the research shows is that these values are very protective in the Latinx community and are related to a host of positive outcomes, including sort of less depressive symptomatology, more academic motivation for kids, better well-being in families. And some even highlight that the positive outcomes in terms of the immigrant paradox in Latinx families, and where immigrant populations do better than non-immigrant populations, are because of these familism values and the social support that one gets in the family. However, research also shows that these values can, in times of stress and duress, be contributing to some more distress. So one of the things that could happen, particularly in the face of violence or stress in a family system, is that these values that are generally protective also play a role in how families interact with one another. And so what I've seen both in my clinical work and just working in the Latinx community and some of the research is that these values make it very challenging to seek support and help. These values make it very challenging to sort of not want to leave a relationship that may be as problematic, or address issues of violence in a relationship, because these values are sort of an overlay of how one should behave. And the support that one might have from their extended family, really it's sort of the promotion is like, we need to keep unity as a family, and the family unit is the most important. What this means is that our policies really need to think about how we intervene at the family level, how we support and how the Latinx community can see support for domestic violence as something that would benefit the family as a whole, and something that is done in sort of the betterment for the family. And that's a really important part. In my review of the literature, we have found that a lot of interventions, and these aren't specific to domestic violence, but just prevention programs for Latinx families, don't explicitly address these values in terms of both engagement in the services that is really important, as well as how the intervention is delivered. And if there's ways in which providers can invite families, can invite survivors, can invite people who are experiencing domestic violence as sort of how this can help their family unit, this could be something that would benefit the broader community. Importantly, it's also to think around what are the stressors that lead to some of these experiences that are important to be addressed and that are limiting folks being able to get the support that they want. So what is it that sort of that Lashonda was talking about earlier, sort of what are these community stressors that exist around discrimination, around access to work, poverty, other pieces that make these experiences of stress in the family lead to potential violence. And so it's really important to address also sort of some of the community contexts that are stressing and distressing to Latinx communities more broadly. We also want to think about other policies that are important to address as well. So the last one I will say before my time is up is the policies around deportation or around different pieces in which they view going to seek help as being a greater risk to their family than for themselves. And if they worry that their family will have other consequences from outside government, that's going to preclude them from seeking help and support for the domestic violence, and not view that as something that is viable to them because the risk to the family is too great. So at that point, I'm sorry that I went longer than my 5 minutes. I look forward to this conversation and to talking more about this.
Thank you, Dr. Liva Stein, for your critical work in this field and really elevating the importance of culture and other community factors. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Blanca L. Lugo. Dr. Lugo has a doctorate of psychology in marriage and family therapy from Alien International University. She has had an extensive career providing psychotherapy to adults and children exposed to domestic violence and worked at Optum Public Center, closely collaborating with the San Diego Child Welfare System. She is a clinical supervisor at the nonprofit agency Hannah's House, where she provides psychotherapy services to children from high conflict divorced families, as well as children who have been exposed to domestic violence. Please welcome Dr. Lugo.
Hi, Marina. Thank you so much. And also thank you, the CHCI Graduate Fellowship Program. Today, I will be discussing effects of domestic violence exposure or intimate partner violence exposure in children, specifically in Latinx children. So in the next slide, we would be able to see that some of the effects of domestic violence on children, and like Senator Wyden explained, 15 million children in the United States are exposed to domestic violence. Some of the effects that these children experience are some verbal, motor, and intellectual development challenges in their ability to focus and learn. That's why a lot of schools will see a drop in their grades once they're exposed to domestic violence and trauma in general. Increased aggression, high activity levels, so they're often misdiagnosed with ADHD and referred for medication. They have high anxiety separating from their parents. So they have sleep disturbance, and obviously if a child is not sleeping well, that will also have an effect on their physical development, school performance, etc. And intense worry about the safety of a parent or parents. So like Lashonda explained, the impact of trauma in a child manifests in some of these symptoms. And on the next slide, we'll also see that some of the long-term effects, like Lashonda explained, will be for these children to grow up and experience alcoholism, intergenerational patterns of interpartner violence and domestic violence, physical health problems, gastrointestinal problems, high levels of diabetes are shown in children who have experienced, or adults who experience domestic violence exposure as children, high hypertension as well, lower self-esteem, higher depressive symptoms, and post-traumatic stress symptomatology. So the Center for Disease Control talks about how a 45% to 60% chance of children exposed to domestic violence, they have 45 to 60% chance of also have co-occurring child abuse. So the risk of exposure to trauma overall is really high. Now, when researching what is this impact specifically in the Latinx community of children, there is very little information. So like Lashonda explained, the Latinx children are not at the center of DV research. And so there is very little information about what the specific impact in terms of trauma it is for them. And so that it's a gap, it's a population that is often overlooked and ignored along with some of the other minorities as well. So on the next slide, we would be able to see that some of the risk factors for resiliency, Dr. Liva Stein talked about how familism is also a protective factor, but in terms of intimate partner violence exposure, it could be a challenge to access resources because they want to protect the family unit. So, and she started to talk about anti-immigrant policies. And so that's something that has a huge impact, according to the research, on even children seeking help, because those two factors, the fact that they want to protect their parents, some of the symptoms of a child worrying about their parents' safety, the anti-immigrant policies, what they hear, the anti-immigrant social environment will inform a child that their parents are at risk of getting deported or having a consequence with law enforcement. So law enforcement and some of the safety measures in place for the general population exposed to domestic violence are not a resource for Latinx children. They will be afraid to speak up in school. They will be afraid to speak up to a police officer. They're afraid of family separation. They're afraid of this grief and loss. And they obviously, again, they mistrust law enforcement. So in terms, like here in California, for example, they've had great success with the policies of implementing restraining orders. The victim does not have to file for a restraining order. The state will implement a restraining order. The state will implement and make sure that the family is safe. When it comes to Latinx children, that has a consequence because the arrest of the offender, the restraining order means the family will not have access to financial resources. The chances of deportation, if there's a certain legal immigration status, are high. And so the children will be even having some other severe financial community consequences if that policy that was designed to protect the family is implemented. So those are some of the considerations, along with some of the access of resources that their moms will have, and some of the language limitations as well. So just some considerations for future policies.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lugo, for the services and resources you continue to provide for Latinx families. That was incredible. I'd now like to introduce our final panelist, Ms. Jackie Marroquin. Jackie Marroquin began her work in the Violence Against Women movement in 2001, working with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors in the Central Valley. Jackie has managed programs and provided anti-oppression, domestic violence, and sexual assault trainings at local, statewide, and national levels. Currently, Ms. Marroquin is a director of programs for the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, where she oversees the capacity building, communications, and policy programs. Please welcome Ms. Jackie Marroquin.
Buenos dias. Well, it's buenos dias in California. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here. And I just want to thank CHCI and particularly you, Marina, for bringing this panel together and having this incredible conversation that is much needed and necessary at this point in time. So I've been listening to the other panelists and I've been thinking, oh, wow, okay, this sounds very familiar to me. And the reason why it sounds very familiar to me is because I am also a survivor of domestic violence as a child. And I've also been in a couple of relationships that were abusive as well. And, you know, one of the things that I kept thinking about as the other panelists were speaking was how much of this, how much of my experience and how much of the experience in my family is really rooted in the ways in which we protected our family, our entire family. You know, I come from a family, we're immigrants and came to this country in 1979, and we've been here ever since. We come from Guatemala, very traditional, very Catholic, very Latino family. And as we were growing up, you know, my parents were recent immigrants, and you know, my parents were afraid of everything, rightfully so. And so as, you know, we realized that there was violence in our home, we decided, you know, I knew that we would never, ever reach out for help outside of our family. We knew that calling law enforcement or calling social services or anything like that was going to be not just detrimental, but catastrophic for our family. And so all of the protective factors sort of that we had within our family were really helpful in the sense of keeping us safe. And at the same time, it kept us very isolated from folks outside of our own family. And so our lives are really kind of small, or, you know, very, not small, but like hyper focused on just our family. As I started to work, I actually had a very similar experience to Marina's when you were in a class, and I happened to take a class in a junior college where somebody from a local domestic violence organization actually came and spoke to us. And it was in that moment that I realized, oh, wow, people are talking about this. This is something that people talk about outside of your homes. And so I became an advocate working directly with survivors. For about 10 years, I worked at a local domestic violence organization in the Central Valley in California, working directly with survivors, many survivors who looked like my mom, who reminded me of my grandmother, folks who reminded me of my own family, and seeing just the systemic barriers that survivors, and particularly Latinx families who are looking for support, the ways in which systems really didn't help. You know, the system, the domestic violence field has done a really great job in the last 40 years or so in setting up a very healthy and a very healthy infrastructure. And by that, I mean, you know, we have domestic violence organizations, we have restraining orders, access to, you know, law enforcement, access to other types of supports for families who need some sort of safety. The problem with the way that it's set up is that it's actually, everything is geared towards separating a family. I knew that my family was not going to be in a position to be separated. In fact, we were going to do everything we could to stay together. And so all of those options, you know, the irony, right, of me working in the domestic violence field now for 20 years, knowing that my own family probably would not avail themselves really of the opportunities or the processes out there, because these systems were not going to recognize, or were not going to really fully recognize the needs of my family, which might have been different than the needs of other families who did in fact want to separate from the person who caused harm. In the last 5-10 years or so, we have been really thinking about what does healing look like with this very healthy infrastructure that we have created in the domestic violence field for the last 40 years. No doubt it has saved lives. And at the same time, we also know that there are many families and many folks out there that are not necessarily seeing themselves in these services. And so for the last 5 years or so, we've really been thinking about what does it look like to heal, and healing for the whole family, not only for the people who have been hurt, the people who have been harmed, but also for those who have caused harm. The people in my family who caused harm are people in my family that, you know, I joke, right, that these are the people in my family that I would do anything for them, right? I would care for them no matter what. And at the same time, I know that these folks need healing. And if we can heal folks who cause harm, then we can actually end domestic violence as we know it. But for the last 40 years or so, we've been focused on what the victims or the survivors need. And now we're really looking at what does it take for an entire family to heal, regardless of whether or not they choose to stay together or separate. It is almost impossible for when there are children involved in a relationship. It is almost impossible for the person who is causing harm to never ever see their children again and never ever communicate with the person whom they have harmed. It is nearly impossible. And we also know that folks who cause harm are likely going to be in another relationship later, where they will also utilize the same tools for harm that they used in their previous relationships. And so because of that, we've really been thinking about what does it look like to provide services to whole families? And what does it look like to provide services to people who cause harm in a way where they are going to be able to speak to their own peers? And whether or not it is more effective to have people who cause harm or who have caused harm talking to other folks who have caused harm, to just say, listen, I did this too. This is not okay behavior. Let's figure out a way to find some healing for you and for your family. Ultimately, that is what's going to make everybody safer. It's going to make not just the family safer, the nuclear family safer, the extended family safer, and also the entire community. It just makes us all safer when we can find a way to find healing. And healing isn't necessarily punishment, right? There's an element of punishment in healing, but there's also about taking accountability and changing your behavior, calling out abusive behavior when you see it. Those are tools that many of these families are really wanting to learn. And so how can we, as folks who are doing this in our fields, how can we provide some of that support for the entire family to actually heal together, regardless of whether they choose to stay together or not? Those are just some of the big questions I've been mulling around for the last 20 years.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie, especially for your continued advocacy of survivors in the program and policy space, and really highlighting that holistic family healing, which I think is really, really salient, especially for people who look like us, for people who identify as Latinx. And so at this point in the program, we're going to begin the Q&A session. I'll start off by asking the first question, the first couple of questions, and then open it up to the audience. So please feel free to engage with any of the panelists, and remember to direct each of your questions to a specific speaker for the sake of time. But I'm really excited to dig deeper into this topic, and I wanted to kick off our Q&A discussion by asking Dr. Liva Stein. I know that you had more to say on the topic of familism, but could you elaborate and explain sort of the vital significance familism plays in assessing treatment or asking for help? Maybe if you wanted to kind of pick up where you left off, or if you have any more, if you have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think Jackie really exemplified exactly what I was talking about, is seeing as the family as the unit of support as opposed to just the survivors. And that if people see that this will help all the members of our family, this is something that is going to help all of us be better and enact these values that are so important to us, that's going to be really key. The other value I wanted to talk about is, you hear in the Latino community a lot talked about machismo or machista kinds of perspectives in terms of where men may hold these beliefs about sort of there's purity in a family, or that they're the ones that rule the family. And I think it's really important to counter that with the caballerismo value, or values around how men and male gender values can really honor the family, contribute to the family, protect the family. And so really helping sort of talking about with folks who are experiencing interpersonal violence in their families about sort of how to be a Latino man in this way that's consistent with their value, and helping them sort of see that. So I think that was the only other piece I would talk about, is that we want to explicitly ask around and assess their values, assess these experiences of their family, and be, I think what's most important is just to do the assessment, to ask them about how much they endorse these values, because not every Latino family is the same. So you really want to understand how much the values are actually influencing how they're engaging in help.
No, thank you so much. I think definitely that role of like culture and familism is certainly really not centered in so many of the conversations we have about domestic violence and how to heal forward from that. So I really appreciate you expanding on that value, and particularly including machismo and machista, because I know that is something that's really, really prevalent in a lot of communities. And again, wanting to thank you for sharing that, our communities aren't a monolith. We are unique, and there's so many different cultures and different values that each family has. So I think that's a really good segue sort of into my next question about how culture and trauma can also carry over into the next generation. And so, Lashonda, I'd love to hear your thoughts and insight on how you've seen intergenerational trauma impact healing in the communities you've worked with, and maybe for folks in the audience who are unfamiliar, explain what intergenerational trauma really is.
Sure, Marina, thank you. So much said. I mean, we could be here for 2 hours, but with the time that we have, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we talk about trauma that's passed down each generation, beginning even in utero, where a mother who is pregnant, exposed to stressors, the sort of the overflow of cortisol into her nervous system has an impact on that unborn child, has an impact on the genetic structure of that child, their predisposition to trauma. There are real impacts. I believe Dr. Lugo talked about some of the outcomes that we see with hypertension, diabetes. We know that when our bodies have a stress response, that there is a physiological response where there's a constriction of blood vessels, there is an increase in insulin. Like there's a response in our body, and if it happens often, all the time, if we're constantly on high alert, right? The pregnant mother is constantly on high fear of threat, then imagine how much exposure to the unborn child of trauma there is. And then when we think of intergenerational trauma, it's not only the physiological, but the ways that attachment is impaired. This ability to connect with the primary caregiver. Oftentimes when one is faced with the threat to their lives or the lives of others, we go into a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And sometimes the body, well, all the time, the body is doing what it needs to do to survive. And so sometimes that means just being numb, sort of dissociating. And so you could imagine someone who's been exposed to severe trauma, domestic violence, maybe being in that dissociated state, even as parents, right? And parenting. And so that ability to connect to their child, that secure attachment that really helps to create a regulated nervous system or tools to regulate, to self-regulate. There's a gap there, maybe because the primary caregiver is in survival mode, or the entire family system is functioning in survival mode. And so this way of connecting, or rather not connecting, that is a way of learning how does the family perform? How do I parent now if that's how I was parented? And so that can have an impact generation after generation. I want to also note that there's intergenerational trauma as well as intergenerational resilience. I'm very, very passionate about what are the protective factors? What has helped someone like me, a Black woman, understanding the trauma of chattel slavery, of oppressive laws and policy? What has helped my family to make it through and for me to feel valued and worthy? And so I would want to know that about our Latinx community. What are the protective factors that have helped to move the generations along and really leverage that and tap into that and expand that as a strategy to overcome the domestic violence and the harm and the trauma that's happening, because there is an opportunity to shift the trajectory of our families where there's violence. The last thing that I want to add, just from Dr. Stein, when you were speaking about, how we perceive help, communities of color, right? So when we talk about this work and policies, I believe that it's important for those who are positioned as first responders, whether they're child welfare, caseworkers, law enforcement, pediatricians who are doing exams, to be culturally responsive Not competent where it's a checkoff list and I've learned everything about Latinx community. Know that you are always becoming and learning and being interested in the lived experiences of these families, but being responsive so that if there is any perceived threat based on historically, right, the way that law enforcement or health or education first responders have engaged with these communities, if they're perceived as help or harm, right? And understanding the importance of starting from that place to engage the family and to not approach the family with an approach that's maybe centered in whiteness or centered in even working within the Black community, but to really be interested about what are the values of this community, and not to say one size fits all, but to be open to learn that and then enter in to support that family based on those values is incredibly important. So I hope that there are policies that would support educating and equipping first responders to engage from a place that recognizes that not all people experience those who identify as supportive options as support just based on historical harm that has happened within some of those same systems. So thank you for allowing me to share.
No, thank you so much. I think it's so important that you mention in respect to intergenerational trauma, intergenerational resilience, right? I think sometimes when we have access to education, and particularly me, I heard this really quote that was like, we are the first to break cycles. But in reality, our families have been breaking cycles for generations and generations before us. And so thinking forward about supportive services and how policy can really have significant impacts on our healing and in really essential ways. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, Dr. Lugo, I want to pivot and sort of ask you, what are some of the challenges you witnessed working specifically with Latinx families? And are these challenges tied to barriers they have when trying to access resources? I know you mentioned anti-immigrant policies. I was wondering if you could share an instance or an example where you really saw that play out in real time as you were trying to give the community the resources it needed.
Yes, definitely the challenges are holistic. Every area of an individual or a family system presents with challenges. So just to give you an example of the just anti-immigrant and some of the other challenges, you have your average Latinx family who has a domestic violence incident, has to call 911. The police comes in, arrests the offender. Typically it is the father. The father gets deported or holed up in immigration, and then child welfare. The police will make a cross report to child welfare system. Child welfare will intervene, and then the mother will be expected to provide a new safe place, right, with the new housing, find a full-time job, find childcare, go to parenting classes, go to therapy, take the children to therapy. The family will be upset at the mother for calling the police, right? Because the father is now incarcerated because it's her fault. Church will also be upset and will be putting a lot of pressure on the mother to reconcile and to get together, despite the fact that there's now a restraining order imposed by the state, and child welfare is pushing mom not to reconcile yet until treatment is going on. The father's family also is very upset at the mother for having called the police, right? They see it as betrayal of this family system. And so the mother is highly stressed. The children grades are dropping. Mother, a lot of linguistic challenges to access services, right? Not all services are available in Spanish, even here in California. The mother's having difficulty communicating with school administrators, with school teachers, because of those linguistic barriers. School teachers are upset because the kids are not performing well. So that's also another pressure. So some of the resiliency factors are community, are school peers and the school institution. and also the child's sense of worth, right? So those are some resiliency factors in children for trauma. And when you have a Latinx family going through that, the child accessing those resiliency factors is very challenging. So that definitely puts this family in a very, very peculiar situation where supportive systems such as church, religion, family, child welfare, law enforcement, it's a double-edged sword. They can offer some supportive services, but also can be re-victimizing the whole family system.
No, thank you. Just hearing that, it makes me think about really this conversation with you all is getting to the root that this issue is intersecting with so many other issues and factors. It makes me think of paid family leave, right? Workforce development, unemployment insurance, things that sometimes are really inaccessible to our communities or, are tied to other policies that, our communities can't necessarily benefit from. I also want to emphasize here for those who are in attendance that policy is not the only mechanism in which folks can impact change, but it can really be a significant one for those who are already doing work on the ground, like professionals such as yourself. And so, Jackie, I'm really hoping that you can bring us home with at least my last question. Sort of considering all of the cultural and trauma-informed factors we've discussed, what are some policy, political barriers you see playing out at the state level that makes progress in doing that sort of holistic healing more difficult to achieve? Or perhaps for those who are watching who work at the state or federal level, what are ways that they can support you using a policy lever?
Oh, this is such a beautiful discussion. I think you can see me like agreeing furiously with everything that everyone is saying here. This is such an important conversation that then can lead to action. So some of the action pieces, like I said before, the domestic violence field has done a really good job of setting up the system, this infrastructure to support families and survivors when there is a crisis. And so that's the crucial entry point for so many families is when there is a crisis, then they search for, they look for, they reach out for help. Depending on what the response to that request is, that family may or may not reach out for help again. And so I think from a state level perspective, one of the things that we have been able to do here in California is to think about intervention as related to but separate from prevention, and that prevention, whether it's prevention, immediately after a situation has happened or way before, like Lashonda said, going farther upstream and actually preventing the abuse from ever occurring in the first place. That is really where we have seen here in California some amazing strides and innovations. We know that there are families out there who need to be physically separated to be safe. Right, that the physical safety of survivors is really the main focus, which is necessary and no doubt again has saved lives. And we also have these other types of safety, right? Whether it's safety around having a place to live, COVID times, right? Safe from a virus that can be deadly. All of those types of safety are necessary. All of those types of prevention efforts are necessary in order for families to have their basic needs met. And so that family, once those basic needs are met, that family can then focus on healing, can then focus on all of the things that they need in order to be okay, to be in relationship together, to be a family together or separately, right? So part of what I think is important in terms of policy is funding for prevention, Here in California, we were able to secure over $20 million in 3 years for prevention funding. Now, prevention funding is not more shelters. Prevention funding is not more restraining orders. Prevention funding really is about bringing a community together with the community, by the community, for peers to talk with one another about the realities that families are facing. And so that, in terms of policies, policies that really fund organizations to do organizing work, community organizing work, bringing families together is incredibly important, because that is where the stressors, right? The stressors that families are already facing, families without violence, without abuse in their homes right now are struggling. I cannot even begin to imagine what a survivor, what, folks who are experiencing abuse are also experiencing on top of the other stresses that we are all experiencing, right? I personally think survivors who are still in violent relationships or who are still in the midst of it are superheroes, because I don't know how folks are able to continue living their daily lives in the midst of all of these pressures. So prevention efforts really do a lot to help ease and to help relieve those pressures that families have in order for them to truly be able to address the root causes of violence, the root causes of abuse. Absent that, we are not going to be able to get to a place where we can find healing for an entire family. I think the second piece is really around this idea of punishment and healing, how those two actually go together and how they might not go together. We talk a lot about accountability. And in the last 40, 50 years, we've done a lot of work to secure and to win win the fight, right? That domestic violence is bad. Like, that kind of violence in our homes is bad. It's not okay. So we've gotten there. And now we are looking at how can we work with people who cause harm in a way that isn't just going to lock folks up, because we've done that for the last 40 years and it's not working. So how can we look at, survivors do this really well. Survivors really humanize, are able to really see the humanity in the people who are harming them. I know I saw the humanity in my family. I saw the humanity in other people who are abusive and who have done a lot of harm. How can we get to a place, how can we create policies that are not only about punishment and locking folks up, but really looking at how can they heal, become safe, healthy people, which will keep everybody else safe and keep folks out of prison, keep folks out of these other systems that we know are also being harmful to our families and to our communities. And that is what survivors want. In my experience working with survivors for 10 years, the number one thing I kept hearing was, I don't want to call the police. I don't want this person to go away. I don't want this person to be deported. I don't want this person to, just get out of my life. I want this person in my life. I need them in my life. Our family needs them in our life. And how can we do that in a way that it's going to be safe, it's going to be healthy, and it's just going to be a change in paradigm for everyone.
Thank you so much. I think, to all of my panelists, I'm just sitting truly in awe of all that you contribute to the conversation, the advocacy that you do, how you all walk in your purpose. And I'm just so thankful to also learn and share this space with you. I think I want to pivot and do some rapid fire questions, as I know we are running up against time, but I know that our audience members have been really engaged in the conversation and have some great questions to ask. So maybe we can do some quick answers, some quick Q&A. I know there is an audience member who asked, what are ways that a friend or outsider could help a survivor in a family where familism is a contributing factor to their hesitancy to come forward? Anyone can jump in.
I'll jump in really quickly and say that in my experience, families and friends are pivotal. They are pivotal to someone asking for assistance or somebody looking for help. I know that the times that I tried to ask for help, I was often met, this was before my professional work, but often they were met with questions like, well, why are you still there? Well, why can't your mom just leave? Well, why can't you, right? These questions that I think from those on the outside looking in sound completely, totally normal, right? Why would you want to stay in a relationship that's abusive? And there are so many other factors that this survivor is really thinking about, that asking those questions is really just blaming the victim for something that they have absolutely no control over. So I think that is incredibly important, a non-judgmental attitude and a non-judgmental approach. And most importantly, knowing that the survivor in that situation is the expert in their situation. They are the expert in their home and in their life. And so that needs to be number one whenever talking to a survivor. And especially if you're a friend or family member, it's so important to just say, listen, I believe you, and there is help, and you decide when you are ready.
And I'll just jump in really quickly that I think one thing we've noticed in the work we've done is that if you say, hey, here's a domestic violence thing, they'll say, no, I don't want that. So linking them into just a therapy, services, someone they can go talk to, a support group, just expanding their social support network if you're able to, can be a really effective intervention as well. It doesn't have to be necessarily domestic violence support. It could be something else, and that would be useful.
Thank you so much for answering that question. And so I think we have time for one more audience question. So from one of our audience members says, I've read that COVID-19 has increased domestic violence situations significantly. Are there any recommendations for community members that want to help children who are in, this remote learning environment confidentially? How can we really link children who are at home experiencing domestic violence, perhaps to resources? Are there any good strategies that you can share within the 2 minutes we have left for Q&A?
I'll just jump in and say it may be helpful to see what resources the children are connected to already. So most children are doing school remotely, or now across the country, some children are going back to school. And so working with the leadership of the school to see if there are parent programs or if there's programming around social emotional learning where you can integrate some tools to help them name things what they are and know how to ask for help. That can be very supportive. I also think identifying within the community where people go for help, typically, if it's a faith-based community where folks go to help, identifying the formal and informal leaders within a community, folks who have the title as leader or folks who don't have the title, but people seek them out for guidance, and really asking how can you partner with them to get information to children, find where the children are now and work with those who are in leadership who are responsible to those children and help them. And then lastly, I just want to quickly say that with trauma, there is healing, and it's a process. And what's universal, no matter one's ethnic identity, their race, is that we have a universal nervous system, and that there are tools that can be accessed to address trauma in the body that can help us move towards a place of healing and regulation. And so I want to leave on that note that there is a way to hope forward by addressing systems and individual, we can help. So thank you.
I also want to quickly add that the best way to help children is to help their caregiver. If the caregiver is not okay, children are not going to be okay.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for I cannot express the amount of gratitude that I have for being in this space with you and being able to learn with you and learn from your insight and experiences and be able to share and elevate this issue, which is so important and impacts so many of our communities, even outside of the Latinx community. And so I think while we are coming close to the end of this great discussion, which I wish could last for 5 hours or could be a running seminar, I would really like to give you all and elevate your voices. If you could give in your 1 minute closing remarks, one thing you would like our audience to take away from today's panel, what would that be? And anyone can go ahead and start.
I will say that domestic violence, any form of interpersonal harm, is not inevitable. We have an opportunity as individuals dealing with this as a human rights issue, as a health issue. We have an opportunity to shift the trajectory. There is a way to get upstream to prevent this. Looking at how we normalize harm and changing that and correcting that. How violence is normalized, changing that and correcting that. Providing equal access to education, to quality health services, and to addressing how behaviors that are seen as delinquent are really reflective of trauma and pain. And so we must treat it as such, as a way to shift the trajectory and move towards healing. And so I just end in saying that we can change this, that this is not inevitable, and that our children, our Latinx children, families, all families are deserving of such support and living a life that is healthy and safer and safe. So thank you for this opportunity to share. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
And I can quickly say that I would love for folks to take away that the resilience of our community, the resilience of our families, and that sometimes when you hear conversations about domestic violence and interpersonal violence in Latinx communities, sort of there's a blaming that happens around machismo or some of the cultural values, but instead having a more nuanced understanding of these cultural values and how they are sources of resilience and how to leverage them in any type of intervention that you do to really heal at the family level is going to be really important. And to not, sort of base it on stereotypes or ideas, but really talk with families about their own experiences.
Thank you.
I will just say what I said earlier, survivors are superheroes. Survivors are the experts in their situation, and they should be the ones in the lead.
I'm going to say that I wish for people to take that one size does not fit all. So different services and different policies should take the cultural needs into consideration.
Well, thank you all to my distinguished panelists for sharing your experiences and your invaluable perspectives. I'd also like to take some time to express gratitude to those who've helped pave the way for me to be here. So thank you to CHCI for amplifying my voice and giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for surviving for me, supporting me, and showing me how unwavering love can be. Gracias a mi nana. Gracias por estar orgulloso de mí y cuidarme. Esto es para ti. Thank you to my grandpa for always checking in on me and making sure I'm well fed. Thank you to my friends and mentors who are watching me from different parts of the country. You know who you are. I couldn't do life without you and your FaceTimes, your consistent reassurance, and the happiness you breathe into my days. You make life worth living. I'd also like to express thank you to all those who attended and listened with open hearts and minds to today's panel discussion. Before we conclude, I want to remind everyone that domestic violence can happen to anyone, by anyone, regardless of race, age, sexual orientation, religion, ability, or gender. It affects people of all socioeconomic backgrounds and education levels. It can happen to intimate partners who are married, living together, or dating. Domestic violence does not discriminate. For those who are watching or listening who've been impacted by domestic violence, you are not alone. You are not the violence that was done to you. I believe you, and you are worthy of healing, and healing is possible. While prevention efforts in California have made considerable progress, it has a long way to go. All children have a right to feel safe and protected at home. To create policy that best serves children, we must actively address existing inequities and disparities head on and restructure prevention so that it is inclusive and comprehensive. For Latino children, this means a policy that addresses health and economic disparities, structural racism, familism, and cultural values that can intensify the impacts of exposure to domestic violence. Prevention policy must also boldly shift away from the punitive to the restorative. That means child separation as a last resort, strategically thinking through the resources family needs, and finding the root of the problem. As we leave this discussion today, I want to emphasize that a domestic violence-free world is possible, and that while we continue to fight for that on a day-to-day basis, we must also do what we can to protect one of our most vulnerable communities, Latino children, from the impacts of domestic violence. Thank you.